Hi everybody, this is Ted. Welcome back to week 6 of EPE 301. We're re-recording this video because we had some audio issues, so hopefully this is going to go smoothly. So over the past 5 weeks, we've built a pretty powerful framework for understanding American education. We started with our central thesis, which is that education is not a value-neutral technical endeavor, but is instead a profoundly social and political one. We've seen how it can sort of act as a battleground for Labourie's competing goals, which were democratic equality, social efficiency, and social mobility. We've traced this tension back to ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, and through Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau and Mary Wollstonecraft. So we've seen how these kinds of abstract debates, philosophical debates, have materialized in history. From Jefferson's enlightened ideal of education for democracy to the sort of horrific coercion of the Indian boarding schools, as well as in Horace Mann's Common School movement, which really kind of perfectly embodied Durkheim's conception of the school as an engine for moral socialization, and that includes the good and the bad. Today, we're going to synthesize these ideas and push them a little bit further by asking one of the foundational questions that I think has been sort of underlining a lot of our discussions thus far in class, which is, what is the fundamental relationship between education and democracy? How does this concept differ from the idea of education as a private commodity? And that's something that we're going to be covering more in depth next week. This week, we'll be using 3 key texts to guide us, which are John Dewey's Democracy in Education, Martin Luther King Jr.'s The Purpose of Education, and Amy Guttman's Democratic Education. Together, I think they form a powerful trilogy arguing that democracy is not just a form of government, but it's a mode of associated living, as Dewey would say. It's about society at large, in a sense, and that can take the form of things like the public sphere, but there's sort of some fundamental building blocks that democracy needs to have outside of just going and voting. And education, these authors would argue, is sort of the essential non-negotiable fuel. So let's start off with Dewey, and I think he sort of provides our most comprehensive theoretical link between education and democracy. For Dewey, as I said, it's more than just participation, going and voting once a year. He sort of understands democracy as a quote-unquote mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. And what does that sort of mean? I mentioned sort of like the idea of the public sphere, but a big part of democracy, for a lot of these thinkers, is basically a society that is able to kind of hold debates, sort of in a rational fashion, and for Dewey, we're kind of talking not just about politics, but sort of a quality of social life where people are able and willing to sort of talk to each other, and be willing to actually change their minds on some things and kind of hash things out. He says that democracy as a system thrives on the widening of the area of shared concerns and a liberation of greater diversity of personal capacities. And that means, like I said, essentially public needs to be able to be willing to meaningfully communicate on terms of public interest. Now let's connect this to our kind of dichotomy of learning versus education that we talked about back in week 3. I think, as I said then, Dewey is sort of the great synthesizer here. He argues that for a democratic society to survive and flourish, the individual's construction of knowledge, which is, the way that an individual is supposed to be learning, has to happen through social relationships, the social relationships of education. The school, therefore, really shouldn't be an isolated garden like in Rousseau's Emile. It cannot just be sort of a transmitter of facts. It really has to function like, a miniature society. Like, if you think of like a terrarium, kind of that's the idea. It's supposed to be like democracy in miniature, according to Dewey. And in this model, students really aren't supposed to just learn, civics or socialization through a textbook. They're supposed to experience it. And those lessons are learned through social interactions. They're going to learn cooperation through group work, just as they are supposed to learn conflict resolution when, problems inevitably arise from interacting with other students. And I think this process really maps well onto our frameworks, which are, first of all, education socializing students into habits of cooperation, discipline, and deference is the sort of kind of common good that Durkheim was talking about with his moral socialization, and preparing students for sort of democratic goal that Labrie identified, which is, creating virtuous and participatory citizens. Now, for Dewey, education as a public good is sort of the very mechanism that creates a democratic society, which is what it's supposed to serve. The society that repudiates external authority, says Dewey, has to find a substitute in the voluntary disposition and interest of its citizens. And these can only be created by education. What that all means basically is that the public good is the creation of a public capable of self-governance in a democracy. Democracy is not going to be able to function if people aren't able to communicate and get their points across. It's not going to be able to work if people aren't able to sort of like figure out what their own interests are. So let's move on now to Martin Luther King. The question is, what is that disposition, or what is that kind of attitude that citizens need to have for a functioning democracy? And what kind of citizens are we supposed to be producing? And this is where MLK comes in. He's writing as an undergraduate, actually, so he's probably not much older than anybody taking this class, if you are taking this class you know, right out of high school, or, in your early 20s. um, so he identifies a fatal flaw in an education system that prioritizes efficiency over ethics. And, this is going to be a debate that we will see in. We can already kind of see a little contrast here with talking about social efficiency as a public good in some cases. King saw around him people who went to college, including the governor of Georgia at the time, who's a segregationist. His name was Georgia Eugene Talmadge. And he basically said, look, you can be educated, you could be a critical thinker, but you can still be a moral failure. You can still have the wrong values behind you. And in his essay, he writes, education must enable one to sift and weigh evidence, to discern the true from the false, the real from the unreal, and the facts from the fiction. This is the critical kind of intellect education has to champion, because MLK he has a warning in his essay. He says, when education stops with efficiency, when education which stops with efficiency may prove the greatest menace to society, and the most dangerous criminal may be gifted with reason but with no morals. Basically here, King's saying that for education to really serve the public good, it has to have some idea of morality or ethics, or the way, or a value. What do we value as a society? Basically, it's, in his opinion, it's not enough for education just to make skilled workers, or for it to allow individuals to prove their own worth and rise kind of through social hierarchy to try to, meet some version of a meritocracy. The complete education, he says, gives one not only power of concentration, but worthy objectives upon which to concentrate. So I think this sort of calls back to some of the darker examples of American education that we've talked about more recently, where, the architects of the Indian boarding school were definitely, by some measure, they were educated. They could think logically and systematically to achieve a goal, but their goal, which is, the erasure of Native American culture, I would say was a pretty big moral catastrophe. They had reason, as King would say, but no character. I think MLK asks us to consider the following when we're talking about education. Education for what? Is it for exploitation, or is it for liberation? Are we reinforcing prejudice, or are we trying to build a more just society? I think moral education in this light is not a private matter for the family alone, but it is sort of an essential public good. And in this light, it gives the power of knowledge to a humane end, to, make a more just society. So we'll move on now to our last reading with Guttman. We have Dewey's framework of a democratic community, and we have MLK's sort of argument for education's role in building a moral character. I think this brings us to a pretty messy political question, which is, who is supposed to decide what moral character looks like? Who gets to define, we have to be teaching values or morality in education. And who's supposed to control the curriculum that's supposed to be, so impactful in shaping the future of a country, our country? And this is the sort of central problem that Amy Guttman is trying to tackle in her book. In the first chapter that we sort of get to read for this class, she looks at 3 different models for who gets to decide how, curriculum. The first one is the family state, which is, sort of a euphemism, but it's essentially the same idea as in Plato's Republic, which is to say that there's a state which is imposing a single vision of the good life on the public. And we saw the danger here of this kind of forced assimilation in Indian boarding schools, and as a part of the common school movement, where basically someone from on high has an idea of culture or what sort of morality looks like, and they can kind of force some pretty inhumane things, especially in reflection. I think we talked briefly about in Plato's Republic that Plato was definitely okay with separating kids from their parents, if putting the kid in a different sort of like class or specialization was going to benefit society more. So really, this keeping society together was sort of the utmost, highest sort of goal for Plato's Republic. The second sort of model that Guttman looks at is the quote-unquote state of families. And that's where parents have all the authority in their children's education. And now this might sound pretty appealing to some folks, but as we saw with man's opponents, if we can't agree as a society on any one vision of education, it can lead to a lot of fragmentation, where some communities are denying children exposure to a wider world. It makes it really hard for us to sort of have a shared language, to agree on certain kinds of values or sort of debate, which can be harder for this idea of a society that can come together and talk about different things. And one other point, I think, in Guttman's view, is that oftentimes we think of parents as being the best source of determining what the welfare of their children should be. But in her view, the welfare of children doesn't always neatly overlap with a parent's freedom to define what that welfare looks like. And what that is to say is, sometimes parents don't always know best, in her opinion, and I know that can be kind of controversial, so I'll let you all come to your own decision on that. The final model is the state of individuals, which is supposed to strive for a neutral sort of education that maximizes individual choice. Basically just provides facts to folks and then lets them come to their own interpretation of what it all means. And Guttman finds this sort of model pretty hard to make work, and honestly probably not very desirable, because as we sort of have laid out, education is a very value-laden project already, and so all that laying facts out is going to do is let people kind of bring in whatever sort of preconceived notions they already have, from other areas, from their family, from their friends. So what's the solution to all of these, to who should shape how we teach children, or our curriculum. Guttman proposes that we should be considering a democratic state of education, which is based on conscious, quote unquote, social reproduction. The idea here is that citizens should be empowered to consciously shape the future of their society through education, which is, something that we've sort of been coming back to. But it's important for them to be able to recognize that. And the way that we prevent the sort of democratic process from becoming a tyranny of the majority, there's two key constraints that she introduces. The first of which is non-repression, which essentially is supposed to prevent any group from using education to stifle rational deliberation. And that means you can't teach your way is the only way by denying students the ability to critically evaluate others. This is supposed to sort of protect critical thinking that both Dewey and King think is really important, and it's one of the ways that sort of society can reinvent itself by sort of just, questioning things of how they are. The second point that Guttman has is that education has to follow a policy of non-discrimination, which means that all educable children have to be included. You can't deny any group the education necessary for civic participation, and I think this is really the logical extension of a democratic ideal that Jefferson's vision, didn't necessarily live up to. And, I guess we now have this sort of hindsight to see, our understanding of what a citizen is, is much bigger, and in some ways I think a fuller realization than what we have had in the past, and obviously Wollstonecraft kind of points that out too. So let's kind of bring this all home. I think for Guttman, the public good is served by a system where authority is shared between parents, citizens, and professional educators. And within these constraints, the good is not supposed to necessarily be a predetermined outcome, but the process of democracy. Basically what she's trying to set up is the preconditions for a democratic process to figure out what it wants. And so that's to say, we don't necessarily know what a group of people would pick, but we could give them the tools, and if the tools are good, hopefully they would be able to come to something that worked for everybody. So, wrapping up, I think, what is the connection between democracy and education? For Dewey, it's constitutive, which is basically to say that education is the fiber of a democratic community. For King, it's moral, which means democracy requires citizens who have both an intellect and a character. And for Guttman, it's procedural, which means democracy requires a shared and constrained authority over education to reproduce itself as a free society. So, is moral education a public good? I would say yes. Without it, as King warned, we sort of risk creating, the highly intelligent, dangerous criminals who, can sort of abuse the system. As Guttman shows, the content of a moral education has to be subject to democratic processes too, though, and we can't necessarily impose it like a philosopher king would, or even isolate it in an individual family. It has to be a morality that prioritizes sort of democratic civic virtues like deliberation, mutual respect, and inclusion. And finally, how does education affect our culture? This course is called Education in American Culture, and we haven't talked too much about culture, but we sort of have. I just haven't directly acknowledged it. I think we've seen it really all semester. It can be a mirror reflecting society's values and an engine propelling society towards the future. It can be a tool for containing what our culture looks like as, Horace Mann's Anglo-Protestant melting pot, or a tool for liberation as Mary Wollstonecraft and Martin Luther King Jr. envisioned. The readings today argue that in a democracy, it has to be that latter part. It has to be liberatory. We have to consciously work to create a culture that is more inclusive, more deliberative, and more just than the one we inherited. And I would say the struggle over education is the struggle for our future as a democratic society. So next week, we're going to be examining the other side of this debate from the perspectives of Adam Smith, Milton Friedman, and Brian Kaplan. And we're going to be asking some questions like, how does education play a role in our individual lives? Did we get it all wrong today? Should the government actually keep its dirty hands out of education, or play as little role as possible to let individuals and their families decide? Has education as a system actually just gotten way too big, and is it now actually having adverse consequences for our society as a whole? So I'll leave you all to think about those questions, and I know this video is now running a little bit long, so thanks for sticking through. Have a good day. Bye.